Good morning. This works? Yes. I won't be speaking as loudly as Charlie, so I'll use the microphone. You probably know me from the old drum, right, as Jerome à Paris, but I'll be speaking in capacity as banker for Dexia. I'm the old-fashioned kind of banker. I'm a victim of the crisis as much as the real economy is these days. We've gone through 3 cycles in project finance where we've been told in 97 that the bond markets, the emerging markets, were the future and we were just boring old-fashioned stuff. Then we had the dot-com boom, same thing. We're told what you're doing is silly and declining and you should just forget about it. And again, in the past 2 years, you had all the securitized products and structured finance, and we're again told that what we were doing was just stupid and not profitable. And but this time they managed to take us down with them because the market for us is closed down as well as for the others. I'll be talking about wind, but I actually have a background in oil and gas. I've been financing oil and gas projects for the past 12 years now. BTC pipeline, Gazprom, Qatar Gas, things like that. So this is not just about wind, it's about energy, and wind is just one solution. At this point, I usually have a nice slide about Dexia showing how strong we have a balance sheet, the great ratings we have, but I'll just avoid that. Now, we have strong shareholders, government of Belgium, government of France. Strong so far, I don't know. They have AAA ratings as well. We'll see what these are worth, but the fact is right now the markets are closed, so we're not doing any lending. So it's very simple. So I'll tell you about the past. We've been very active in wind financing along with other energy sectors. We finance projects all over the world. We've lost count because we have done some refinancings of projects, but we financed close to 10 gigawatts of wind projects in the past 6 years on 5 continents. And we've put about 3 billion of our own money. We haven't lost any of it. It's still worth 3 billion, and it will be repaid because it's sales of electricity, and you're still using electricity. Now, wind. The purpose of this presentation is to convince, I use it to convince people in ministries and other industries that wind is actually a serious industry and it's worth reporting and it's part of the solution. It's not just dirty fucking hippies doing this in their corner. It's nice but essentially pointless. Wind work on a large scale, and it is supported by the public and it is supported by politicians, which is what matters. It will be the major contributor to EU goals of the 2020-20. One of the 20s is 20% of renewables, so for that goal to be reached, you need to build more wind because there's pretty much nothing else that can be built. Hydro is built. The bio things are, well, they're not fuel sources, as has been discussed. So you really have wind and maybe solar in the later years. What's interesting is that wind has actually already been a major part of what Europe has been doing. If you look at that graph, wind power has represented 40% of the new installed capacity over this decade already. You have gas and you have wind. Of course, wind megawatts are not quite the same as nuclear gas megawatts, so, but the trend still holds true in megawatt hours. The reality is, when you look at this, is that Europe has actually spent more money on wind than on anything else over the past 8 years, and this trend will continue. So GE, Siemens, all of the big companies have been investing in wind. It is a major industry. It's probably one of the few industrial sectors that's actually creating jobs in large numbers today, and that's an argument that may come to the fore into the future. The thing is, it is already a big industrial sector in its own. people say it's small, it's not going to be part of the solution. It's as small as nuclear was 30 years ago. It's been following the exact same curve. If you look at hydro 100 years ago, you have a fairly similar curve. So it's just at that stage where it's getting macroeconomic significance, and we'll just see in the 5 years if it reaches the kind of production levels that nuclear reach. And 5 years from now, if you look at that curve, is when you hit the 70s with what was discussed yesterday with the oil shocks and 3 Mile Island killing the sector. It's quite unlikely that we'll have a 3 Mile Island type incident to disrupt the wind industry in the coming years. So to go into offshore so far still been at the experimental prototype phase. You've had a small number of pilot projects in a few countries, Denmark, UK, Netherlands, Sweden. The expectation that it's going to enter the industrial phase pretty much starting next year, moving from 200-300 megawatts per year to 1,000 and then to multi-thousand megawatts construction per year. So you have the regulatory framework in the UK and Germany, which are widely expected to be the 2 largest markets that are now fully in place. And basically, you now need to build a supply chain. There's a bit of a rush right now because everybody wants turbines in 2011 and 12, so the supply chain is a bit constrained. But after the first few years, the industry will build up capacity and will settle at a rhythm of, say, 15 to 2,000 gigawatts, 15 to 2,000 megawatts, so 2 gigawatts per year offshore wind installed in Europe. Now, an interesting thing about wind is that it's very different from other source of energy. Oil, the more you use oil, the more expensive it is. Wind, the more you use wind, the less expensive electricity gets, because wind is a zero marginal cost producer. And now that we're, thanks to our happy EU economists, in a fully market deregulated economy, electricity is sold not at the average price, not at the production price, but at the marginal cost at any time. And basically at any time demand is fixed by people switching on and off. So you look at your supply curve, the more expensive producers, and you look what is the most expensive producer you need at any time to fulfill that demand, and that producer will set the price for electricity at that time. That's marginal cost. If you put in wind into the equation, you reply the more expensive producers by zero cost wind, and the price will go down. In Denmark, they've done studies in days where you have wind and days you don't have wind, and that's the price difference that you see. Wind pretty much halves the price at high prices. It has very little impact when you have low demand, but it has a very strong impact when you have high demand. And thanks to when you have lower prices for everybody, not just for the marginal buyer, the price applies to everybody, and you get a price saving at that time that goes to the consumers. And the studies show that in Denmark, the cost savings for consumers are now in the same range as the gross level of subsidy provided to wind. And gross level is important because you pay X cents per kilowatt hour to wind, but the subsidy is actually the difference between that price and the market price. And if you look at wholesale market prices right now, Belgium, Germany, France, the main European markets, prices at around 70 to 80 euros per megawatt hour, and the feed-in tariff are at 80, so the subsidy to wind right now is zero. So the blue column has gone down to zero, but the price reduction effect is still there and is growing as wind capacity increases. So the more wind you have, the lower the price is. It's actually also a reason why you will always need to have tariffs for wind, because the more wind you have, the less revenues there is under market prices. So you need to stabilize the revenue for wind in order for that benefit to accrue. But same thing calculated in Germany, 5 billion euros per year saved thanks to wind penetration right now in Germany with only 10% penetration. Denmark is at 25%, Germany is at 10%. You already get 5 billion euros of savings per year, which is already more than the tariff is, again, on a gross level. This is an important point. Wind and renewable energies are not an affordable luxury. You don't have this distinction between protecting the environment or avoiding carbon emissions and saving the economy. This is actually making sense for the economy. Some graphs in terms of cost per megawatt hour of various technologies. Wind is roughly in the same range as the other technologies with no price risk. Offshore wind is still a bit more expensive, simply because it's further away. It's more complicated to build the foundations, and it's more complicated to get there and replace parts when they fall down. I'll just avoid solar. That's a graph that will show market parity for solar. So you should have a boom in solar as well as grid parity is reached. I'll avoid this. Just a word about project finance and finance. Project finance is a technique whereby you don't finance a sponsor, you just finance a project, and you get repaid only from the cash flows of that project. So I'm not financing EDF or Iberdrola or Goldman Sachs. I'm financing a wind farm, a pipeline, or a power plant, so the wind farm, and I'm only repaid by the generation from that wind farm. It's very safe because basically, since you only have that one asset, you really care about what's happening, so you want to make sure that it's going to be built properly, it's going to be operated properly, it's going to be able to sell its production over the next 15 to 20 years. So you worry about all these things and you make sure that they happen right. So this is old-fashioned banking in that we actually care about risk and risk analysis, and that's what's been forgotten in the past few years of the banking crisis. Bankers forgot all about risk. They thought there was no risk. You could just lend people that had no money to buy a house. The price of the house would increase, and boom, you'd be repaid. It's not banking. I actually say it's printing money. It's counterfeiting money. So what bankers have been doing is money counterfeiting. We're not part of that. Oh, so I think. But anyway. Project finance is used by all investors. The small developers that have started wind power when it was not seen as a serious thing. The financial investors that actually like wind because it provides stable revenues. You have a stable regulatory framework, so you have the revenues are very well known. There's no speculation possible. When you have a feed-in tariff, your revenue is what it's going to be for the next 15 years. There's no possibility to speculate. So you go for investors that are looking for low-risk, stable revenues. Pension plans, the old-fashioned kind, love that kind of assets, and they do invest in that. And utilities that are building a lot of new power plants like it because non-recourse finance means non-recourse to them, so they're off the hook if the project doesn't work. So out of 50 billion of investment in the renewable sector, about 30 billion were financed by the banks. That's just the number of deals. In terms of risks, again, the real bankers do risk analysis, so I'll go into the risk to show you the kind of things we do and how we look at the future and how we look. A project needs to run for 15 to 20 years to be reimbursed, so we need to look at what can happen during these 15 to 20 years. The first risk is regulatory risk, political risk. When you build a pipeline from Russia, you worry about what the government of Russia is going to do with gas. When you build a wind farm in Spain or in France, you worry about what the government is going to do to the tariffs and to the permits necessary for a wind farm. Thankfully, in OECD countries, you've got stable political framework, real commitment to frameworks that work. The one exception, of course, is the US, where there is a framework that does work, but it's highly unstable because it's always renewed at the last minute. That's the PTC mechanism. It works, it's fine, but you need it for 5 years, and it's actually creating havoc for the industry worldwide, because as long as the industry needs to be able to survive a market at 25 or at 20, depending if the US is there or not that year, they're not going to invest. So the manufacturers have been under-investing because they're worrying every year that the US market will disappear. So the US PTC has a real impact. When it's there, when the regulatory framework is there, we're happy to lend money for 20 years. The income side is price and volume risk. Can we sell the electricity? People say, when is intermittent? You don't know when it's produced. Can you actually sell it into the market? Do you need to pay penalties if you don't produce? That depends on the regulatory framework and how the market is organized. When you have feed-in tariffs, there's no risk. It's the simplest solution. But even merchant risk and pure market solution can be funded with more conservative assumptions on prices. Construction risk, you have to worry that your project is going to be built. It's actually fairly simple. It's a bit of concrete, steel towers, and you're putting your turbine over there. Actually, the biggest risk these days is logistics. The biggest turbine models simply cannot be transported by road. I don't have a picture here, but actually I'll show you a picture of that little thing at the top that you see on the picture over there. Here's the size of the thing that's up there. Give you an idea of how big this is. The blades are 60 meters long each. So it's that's a 5 megawatt turbine. So logistics is the main issue, but that's something that engineers can solve. We take a lot of pride that we actually finance engineers and not traders. There's a number of manufacturers that are there that we like. The large-scale turbines have been proven. They have a track record. You see, that's the availability of turbines over pretty much the worldwide portfolio of wind farms. So you have quite a number of wind farms that have reached 10 years, and availability is between 96 and 98% on a very consistent basis. Long-term operations and maintenance is what you care about. You need the people to make sure that these things keep on working. So moving on to offshore, the interesting, 5 minutes, okay. The interesting thing about offshore is that you have two industries that did not know one another coming together. That's the wind industry and the offshore construction industry. And they're learning to work together now. So this brings new coordination and management challenges, which are easy to solve. Other industries have done it. You just need to bring the competence into the industry. So offshore wind is complicated only in the sense that it hasn't been done before and people need to learn how to do it. But it's not something that cannot be done. And it's being resolved right now as we speak. The biggest issue is still the long-term O&M, both in terms of performance and cost. It's at sea, so it's a very corrosive environment. The turbines are actually working at much higher capacity levels than onshore, so they get damaged and used. The burn is simply faster. And you have the weather uncertainty. If the weather is too bad, you simply can't access there and you can't go and repair them. So there's a lot more uncertainty there, and we're working on finding new procedures and things, and bankers are work together with the industry and sponsors to find ways to take that risk in a systematic way. The solution that we've come up with is, I don't know if we have enough time to go into the detail, but typically your revenue is going to depend on the performance of the wind farm. The manufacturer or the operator is going to guarantee that performance. A normal guarantee, it means that they're going to be paying part of the revenue lost if they don't perform. That would be the dotted line. There's a limit to how much they're going to pay in penalty for any period, so that protects you only to some extent. So the kind of structures that we look at is that the penalties get triggered at a lower level but reach a higher amount per capita. So it protects the banks from the worst case scenarios. It gives the manufacturers more flexibility to deal with issues, so the engineers are not under so much pressure to solve problems on a short-term basis, and the investors get more money from the banks thanks to the structure. So there are ways for everybody to invest in these and deal with the long-term risks. Now, a few words about the banking crisis. Like I said, project finance is a well-tested financial technique. It's boring and old-fashioned. It's pretty big, but it wasn't seen as a racy part of the market. It's been impacted by the crisis in the sense that the banks no longer have any liquidity. We're heavy consumers of liquidity because we lend long term, and right now the market is closed for project finance. And when I say close, I actually mean close. We're forbidden from doing anything until the end of the year right now. So don't ask me for money. No, I don't have any. I actually don't have any. It's actually an issue for offshore, as offshore is big projects. The typical German project is going to be 400 megawatts. That's 1.2, 1.3 billion euros investment, out of which about 1 billion could be expected to be financed by banks. If each bank can provide zero, you need a lot of banks to get there. More realistically, you can expect that banks will be able to put 50 to 100 million each. The problem is that the universe of banks that have done offshore is still relatively small. You have 10 to 12 banks. So you need all of them right now to come into each individual project. If you want to build 3 or 4 per year, it's going to be an issue to do that. So this is a real issue. The financial crisis may slow down the development of offshore wind in the short term. Hopefully, if liquidity comes back, project finance should be one of the first bits of banking that comes back again, because it's real banking the old-fashioned way, and we know what risks we're taking. I won't go into the details of the 2 projects that we have that we have actually financed so far. Maybe I can give you more details if you have questions. We financed the new 5-megawatt turbine, so instead I'll just show you the pictures. This is the Q7 wind farm. That's Vestas 2-megawatt turbines, 60 of them. And we financed it 2 years ago. It's been built and completed in June, and it's now operating. They've repaid their first installment, so everything is doing fine. This is Sea Power, the pictures taken a few weeks ago. The six turbines have now been built. They're finishing the cable connections. Should be in operations before the end of the year. So also going more or less under schedule. There's been lots of incidents on both projects that engineers and bankers have managed to deal with on a pragmatic basis. So this is it. If you want to keep 2 things from this, is that wind is going to be a major part of the solution in the near future. It is big enough. It is in the low single digit or below 1% of primary energy right now, but it's on track to reach double digits fairly quickly. It's there in Europe already, so don't dismiss it as a solution that cannot work or won't work. It will work. It will be a significant part of it. And there are bits of banking that are actually useful and that can help real activity happen, and hopefully will still be around in the coming future. There you go.
People can hear me. What I'm wondering is whether at a time of banking crisis, as you correctly say, the oil companies who have very strong balance sheets and pretty established cash flows are going to use this as an opportunity to come in and buy up all sorts of alternative energies. Do you see this as something likely to happen?
Companies, but the traditional utilities, the power companies, are investing heavily right now into the market. They're buying the smaller players, and they're investing in these projects on their balance sheet. The RWEs, E.ON, EDF, Iberdrola, EDP. The oil companies have been surprisingly absent from the market. Shell has a wind operation, but they're winding it down in Europe. I don't understand why, but they're closing shop. They're still active in the US. They sold recently, they had a share in the London Array project in the UK. They sold it to the other utilities in there. The other oil companies don't seem to believe in wind at all. For whatever reason, I've never understood it, but they're not active at all in that sector. Shell is focusing on biofuels, BP more on solar, Total on solar as well, but wind doesn't seem to be of interest to them. But the power companies are extremely active in the sector.
Maybe I missed something. What exactly is non-recourse financing?
Non-recourse means that if the project doesn't work, you cannot go back to the investor and say, please pay me back. You only get paid back from the revenue actually generated from the project. So you don't have recourse to the investors.
Thanks.
Tons, you still need thousands of tons of iron to build the mills. And Dr. Bardi told us yesterday that we need a lot of energy to go for the iron. And the energy basically is oil, and oil is missing. So how are you going to solve the problem?
If you take the current level of wind construction, you're at less than 0.1% of worldwide steel consumption. So if you increase it by tenfold, which is the kind of things that are seen as necessary to get to the kind of read, you'll still be using 1% of world steel. I think this is something that can be found.
Any more question? Okay, sorry.
Yes. How do you deal with the integration to the energy system? Because, of course, there is intermittency in the production, and we are used to have energy available as we ask for it, as we when we want it. So a clue would be to change this habit and say, okay, now we have a sort of forecast of what kind of wind we have tomorrow, so what kind of energy we have tomorrow. That would be a part of the solution. If wind is a major part of the energy system, let's dream a little. And the other way round would be just to have a little wind in the energy system. So I don't know how you see this.
Well, to be frank, this is a problem that's been overblown by opponents of wind. You can go to 20% in terms of megawatt hours, not megawatts, megawatt hours actual production with basically zero investment into the grid. You can go to 40% with fairly minor investment and adjustments to the grid. So let's get there before we start worrying about more. And there's a simple solution to having to go to 50, 60, 70% is just keep the coal and gas-fired plants and only use them when there's no wind. The problem is not gas-fired plants, it's actually burning the gas. So if you keep the gas-fired plants and you use them a few days per month or per year, then you will reduce your consumption of fossil fuels massively. And gas plants have a long track record of being used as peaker plants when they're used at 2 or 5% of capacity. So it's not a problem. These plants are already there. You don't need to build new plants. You just need to use the existing ones. So let's stop saying that when you build wind, you need to build new capacity with it. It's just false. You just integrate it into the grid. The French network operator, which was very wary of wind, they say we have a very fine system that works. Why should we take all these wind turbines? And they published their yearly report this year, and they say wind is actually nice. It brings stability all over the network because you have power electronics in all the turbines. So in isolated bits of the network is actually more stable thanks to wind. And France is lucky enough to have 3 different regions that are independent, 3 climate regions that are independent. So the overall effects, they're saying a megawatt hour of wind fully displaces a megawatt hour of thermal power. So they were reluctant, and now they're happy, and they've become big fans. And they've taken studies, they've taken 40 years of meteorological data, and they said, what happens if we have 10 times more wind than today? Say, it's the same thing. We won't have any problems to go from 2 gigawatts to 15 gigawatts. So the network operators are adapting, and it's fairly minor efforts that they need to do, and in some cases it actually brings good outcomes as well.